Welcome to Smarter Impact. It's Philip Bateman here, and I'm really excited to be having this conversation with Alex Hannant, and I'd like to welcome you, Alex.
Hi, Philip. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Alex, you're the Professor of Practice and Co-Director of the Yunus Centre for Social Business at Griffith University. I've also got here you serve on the board of B-Lab Australia and New Zealand, and previously have been the CEO of the Akina Foundation, which was New Zealand's primary support organisation for social enterprise, and New Zealand government strategic partner on social development, sector development. And you've been the founding member of the New Zealand Advisory Board for Impact Investment. So it sounds like you care, for want of a better term.
I do. Yeah, it's almost sort of pathological, I think, really, but I don't really know what to do if I wasn't doing this.
The thing that really struck me is you've got an impact finance R&D program I was looking through, and you said, how can the incumbents of a system that have been highly successful be motivated to transition or indeed help build a new financing system that operates with very differently and more democratically determined goals, norms, and rules? When I look through all of the stuff, I'm like, well, there's that fundamental tension. We're talking about shifting impact. We're talking about shifting finance to impact. How do you wrestle with that?
Well, I think our role at the moment is really to open up that conversation, because while you say that's a kind of, a key tension, I'm not sure how commonly we recognize that is a tension. So, I mean, look, I think some amazing progress has been made in, from, the origins of social finance into the emergence of impact investment and the mainstreaming of impact in finance more broadly. But we're still essentially using a set of structures, tools, and mindsets which have been developed to serve a different purpose. So to think about how we allocate capital effectively to maximize returns is a different task to thinking how we understand and foster systems change.
Yeah.
So while I think, it's incredibly encouraging, the kind of movement into impact and the recognition that we need to use finance to create a broader range of value, I still think we're somewhere away to thinking, well, actually, if we're going to really be transformational about this, we might actually have to take a deeper look at the structures and tools and approaches that we've developed for that previous, more sort of commercially minded purpose.
Yeah, I'm going back to the layer cake, the action movie from like 15 years ago, where he talked about the different layers of how things are. And I think we've got, making money, and then people becoming aware of making money aligned with ethics. And then we've got transitions of entire making money funds into making impact. And we were previously in the research, I was looking at you talking to the need to invest in the edges of the system to transform the system, as it were, and how to go about creating that transition. Are there any more layers that you see? Like we were just talking through the macro level of systems. What are the what's the nuance that you see?
Look, I mean, I think there is a layer there. I'm not sure if it's on top or sits somewhere, amongst the icing and the sponge, but around, who is considered investable, and this sort of, who gets access to finance and how many people are we actually enabling and including in the process of transformation or sort of the impact movement. And are there also inherent biases and constraints with the way that we think about creditworthiness and investability, which are actually, holding back resources to a range of different actors and activities who, if supported in a way which was enabling to them, could actually be, far more powerful in the change that they want to create, for themselves, their communities, and the places around them. So I think that democratization and the accessibility around finance is a layer within there. But sort of coming back down to the point that you mentioned about the system, and I guess this is another area where I think there's kind of a key difference in the way that we've previously thought about finance to how we might want to think about finance in impact going forward, in so much as quite often we diversify our portfolios to manage risk. right? So we actually avoid things which, potentially have contagion between them. But when we're thinking about systems change, we know that, all the big challenges we're trying to address have these deep interdependencies and interconnections. So if we're going to shift them, we actually have to harness those interconnections and synergies rather than, avoid them to manage the exposure of any given investment. So it's just another example of how our mindsets have to shift if we're going to be, I think, more successful in really shifting the big things that we need to get right over the next, 30, 50 years.
So who are you talking to there? Is it governments or is it individual? So I'm sort of running this theme in the background of like, well, we need layers. Well, essentially, the question I was going to ask is, time and money are the constraints for change per se. And I don't think money is actually that much of a constraint. It's more about values, because people will find the money when it's needed. I think, essentially we were all on universal basic income for the past 2 years in Australia as a response to COVID. And I was like, oh, wow, that just happened. If you were focusing the next 20 years of people's lives, do you think it's the regulation that's going to bring about this change, or is it the for-profit enterprise or not-for-profit enterprise per se?
Yeah, again, we have to have a sort of a systems lens on this. So it's going to be no one thing. It's going to be the combination of things working better together. So absolutely, policy is, incredibly important. Regulation, legislation. The parties and actors who have accumulated significant wealth and want to invest, but also the structures which allow a broader participation, crowdfunding, the emergence of decentralized finance. All those kind of things are going to be equally important. And then, there's no point having a supply of finance unless we've also got sort of an enabling environment for people to be more creative and to actually sort of create the possibility of new projects, ventures, programs, activities, which can take on board that resource and then foster change. So it's a whole ecosystem of interventions which are needed to foster systems transition and change. I mean, you mentioned, who are we speaking to? I mean, pretty much everyone, I would say. Again, it's about trying to link, the different actors in the system. So I think there is, for people who are engaged in impact, there is a increasing anxiety that we're not where we need to be. We've never had more kind of capability and resources, but a lot of the big indicators around the things which are fundamentally important, be it climate inequality, degradation of land, health systems, are worrying, and many of them are going in the wrong way, and we're not responding to them with the trajectories that we need. So I think that anxiety and that pressure to think like we're going to have to do things differently because the things we're doing now aren't sufficient is creating a curiosity around what the new things might be. And I have to say, Philip, I mean, we are in the business of exploration and experimentation, right? That we don't have answers, but we are trying to sort of, step back and say, what might be the possible directions to do things better? And how do we actually test those things to see, if they can realize the, sort of the outcomes that we're hopeful for?
Yeah. Oh, you kind of cut off my next question, because I was going to go, if we're making this layer cake, let's go to the ingredients. So what are the things, what do we do? How do we make this? But it does stand as a question, because I mean, what are you testing? What are you measuring? What sort of, how do we make this relatable for people who aren't like way up at a systems level?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first thing, I think the first layer is an appetite for change, and the second layer is an imagination of how things might be done differently. It's like, that may sound a bit soft, but imagination is a precondition of any change. We actually have to create pictures of how we might do things differently before we can act and do things differently. So in the first sense, we're trying to sort of build coalitions of people who are I suppose, adventurous around experimenting around systems innovation, and that includes, sort of approaches to finance. What we're doing at the moment, and we hope to release it in the new year, is almost like a blueprint that if you were to design a systems approach to, sort of a financing fund or intermediary or vehicle, what would that look like? What would the design considerations be for that thing which could allocate capital in the systems context?
Mm.
And then hot on the heels of that, we want to do some demonstration projects which actually give this a go.
Mm.
So what might they look like? And for me, there's a couple of basic models in my mind,
Yeah.
and there are many more. One might be thinking around, what does a green transition or an energy transition or a net zero transition look like in a place or a city or a region? And when we talk about systems lens, what that means is, how do you make sure that when you're kind of thinking about stranded assets, when you're thinking about new industrial investments, how do you also allocate capital to satellite activities which might come from more of a community level or a sort of social, an impact enterprise level? How do you also allocate capital into, the development of new skills? How do you make sure that everyone gets access to those programs which might new build skills? How might you support the acquisition, by community of different assets which they can generate new economic models around? So rather than, and at the moment, and this is of course, incredibly difficult, but at the moment, most of those things happen in silos and are blind to each other.
Yeah.
And what we're sort of saying is, even if we were to do a few of those things, how might we actually sort of think about the thigh bones connected to the knee bone, which is connected to the hip bone, and recognize if we put a certain form of finance in that would be supported if we put a different finance over there. And the synergies and interconnections and feedback of these things working well improves the chances of the whole system moving more quickly and more successfully. The other example might be, where you have a network of actors who are already working in kind of a systems way quite effectively. And so one group comes to mind, the Move In Feast network of social enterprise around the food system in Melbourne and Greater Melbourne. And they have also attracted a lot of supporters from corporate sector, philanthropy, government. So you've got a sort of system there of, sort of any number of social enterprises who are already starting to work as their own individual organizations, but also recognize they're a kind of value system. They're a systems enterprise as well as a collection of individual enterprises. So how might you think about investing in that whole network rather than just individual enterprises? Recognizing that some enterprises, if they increase their capability, might increase supply and demand to another point in the system. And if that part isn't capitalized, then this bit might not work.
Yeah.
So do you see what I mean? It's sort of understanding where the interlinkages are and then allocating capital in a smart way, which kind of raises everything up together. So they're the two demonstration projects. I'm not saying, we would do that with, sort of Move In Feast, but how do we capitalize a system or a network which is already functional to, sort of strengthen its work and sort of increase its liquidity and velocity of activity? And then how might we take a place-based approach to a key system, be that energy transition or health or what have you, and think around what are the key actors and what are the key interconnections, which if we kind of capitalize intelligently, they would support each other.
And I've got three questions in my mind. To capitalize something, I'm assuming the person capitalizing it wants a return on that capital. So when we talk about capitalizing on a systems level, how do you see return being generated?
So I think this is a bigger mindset shift. And it comes back down to the idea that we are kind of, the world works with obviously there's a lot of public capital, governments, and some community capital, sort of held by certain foundations or other entities. But a lot of that capital moving is private, particularly in the impact investment space. Now, one of the problems, even enlightened impact investors have their own interests, they have their own structures, they have their own application and due diligence processes. And all that noise actually creates a lot of friction of working in a systemic way. I often think about, like, if I was doing a sort of DIY job at my home, I really need a toolbox where I can use all the things to do the job I need to do. But at the moment, I have to go around all my different neighbours and borrowing individual tools in different terms. And the job, takes a long time to do. And if it was a boiler, I might have flooded my property before I can get the job done. So I think the fact is, it's not only the return profiles, it's also how individual actors operate as well. So what we're thinking about is like, how can we create sort of pools of capital which are fit for purpose for this sort of systems allocation? So I've seen some people, it's not that we're alone working on this system finance, this is going on, it seems like quite a lot of these things, like something comes up and suddenly it's happening all around the world in sort of different expressions, I've seen some people say, like, if we get enough different sources of capital, we can aggregate that, which gives us flexibility. I'm skeptical about that because I think you would need a significant amount of capital to actually get to the point where you really do get that kind of free flowing ability. So might we, either have, investors who have a really enlightened view and are basically saying, we are going to decouple our own interests, to basically, because we know, or we have a sense that the systems approach actually might be really powerful. So we basically kind of remove ourselves from the governance and management of funds. I think other ways are, how do we use decentralized finance? And sort of the third iteration of the internet is going to be a profound game changer, I think, in this. Small amounts of money from, or maybe some large amounts of money from lots of different parties who are kind of appreciative of different forms of value, and a lot around that kind of token economies. It's got that liquidity, so people can come in and out rather than sort of be beholden to being locked into a fund for a long period of time. And the third, I think we should be more creative in actually kind of generating new forms of capital. So, I mean, to a limited degree, although it did get politicized, the establishment of big society capital in the UK kind of was based on this, right? So dormant bank accounts, the government lent on the banks who had, had their tails between their legs because of the financial crisis. And you had suddenly a bunch of liquidity brought into play, which effectively, was new capital because it didn't have individual interests attached to it, although in big society capital, obviously the government had an interest. But we've just seen, Philip, like in the last, year and a half, about 16, 17 trillion US dollars worth of quantitative easing. Might some of that quantitative easing actually be allocated to specific areas of transformation? So, because I mean, effectively,
to flood the financial system back to a level of price parity to stop interest hikes.
I mean, look, again, politically incredibly hard. But if you step back and look about what we've done, we've basically inflated asset prices and increased the wealth of the wealthy from the public purse. And there might have been some more enlightened things we could have done with that significant amount of quantitative easing, which was particularly around carbon, decarbonisation, or specifically around reconciliation, or specifically around kind of, sort of equity and levelling up. So we could have been more, we create money all the time. And I guess the problem there is you're inviting, sort of government, which is kind of has huge amounts of inertia around what it feels it can and cannot do, to do something which is kind of, pretty risky and progressive. So
essentially flipping the core value to gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product, and trying to increase that is probably we get what we measure per se.
And a specific example of that, it's interesting, the new Scottish investment bank is kind of built on a kind of mission orientated innovation approach, and is sort of thinking around, we are going to think about returns in this far more kind of enlightened sort of broader view. And financial returns are important, but also within our portfolio, social returns and environmental change are equally as valuable. So I don't know. I think a lot of this is not it's trying to be bold and radical in the things that we need to do, but also being patient and pragmatic, recognizing these things might take a long time to filter through.
Yeah.
But kind of where we are now, and the university as an institution, that's kind of our job in some ways. We need to be working a number of years in advance to try and sort of create the pictures and the possibilities for then practice to move into.
Especially, I mean, from an education standpoint, that you've got people who are entering what's going to be the mental zeitgeist that they're going to create themselves inside of and self-actualize in. So to me, painting a horizon 10, 20, 30, 40 years out that's based on the fruitful success of our society, rather than just saying this is learn how to be an investment banker and go off into the world, is so critical. Because
I think you raised such an important point there. A lot of the things which seem hard now are hard because we work in certain paradigms and certain mindsets. We know from history that that's very fluid and dynamic. Things, if one thing you can be certain about is change happens. So some of the things that seem hard now will seem easier as kind of mindsets and paradigms and sort of, to a certain degree, kind of consciousness shift. So again, it's like Milton Friedman, arguably on the other side of the fence, but he had that quote, have ideas lying around in a crisis. And I think that's the thing. We need sort of believable, credible stories around how we can do things differently for when those kind of inflection points come. And I mean, you used quite a positive framing, which I think is really important. I think that's part of it. But I also think over the next 30 years, there are going to be some real crunch forces, which will also, push us to have to think differently as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, simply population migration. I think borders will relatively dissolve when we have population migration due to climate impacts predominantly based on water. I think that's going to be the massive thing that's going to just, borders won't exist when you've got 1 million people walking across them. We're privileged that we're an isolated island down here, but if we get into cyclical bushfires and our season creeps in so we can't get the wildfire equipment from California on a rotational basis, we got real problems.
Yeah, look, I mean, I kind of play with this idea of 3 forces which are going to kind of define the spaces that we act in over the next 30 years. One is the Great Transition, which I think is, we kind of...
Can you explain that for me?
I mean, the Great Transition, which will be fundamentally a net zero transition. But I do think we kind of, sort of rationalize that as a kind of, sort of economic and technological process that, as long as we get right, will go well. But I think it's not just around the energy system, right? It's the food system, it's logistics, it's materials, it's behavior, it's urban environments. That the push to effectively have a decarbonised modern economy will change everything.
Yeah.
And I think it will swallow up everything as well and move faster than perhaps we can imagine at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's one of them. I think the second one's going to be around exponential technologies, general technologies, sort of AI, how that's applied to really sort of, all productive sectors. And that's going to realize plenty of breakthroughs and opportunities. Some of the stuff around sort of how that will impact on biology and health is really exciting. But it's also going to play out in military, and we're seeing that already. But, maybe a bit further along the line, but quantum computing, the possibility of, nuclear fusion, the new generation of the internet and how that's kind of just unlocking, this huge surge of kind of creativity and innovation. And a lot of that's actually around how we organize and govern. And then the third force.
I forgot about fusion. I was like, oh yeah, we were going to get free 0-point energy. Like we've been working on for 20 years just in a lab somewhere,
I mean, it's one of those things. It's always 10 years away, right? But and I think minimally it is, but there is progress being made there. And again, one of the things that we know about technology is just like they tend to be non-linear changes, and breakthroughs in other areas then overlap, with well, it's, as I say, this goes back to sort of interconnections between things.
Mm.
But the third force, I think, is around equity and empowerment.
Mm.
So this build up of inequality, very visible inequality, around not just wealth, but resources and opportunity. And you kind of, that's been amplified. We spoke earlier and sort of about the asset increases through COVID. So that's amplifying as well. And again, history tells us you tend to have breaking points. Sort of when inequality gets too high, there is a self-correction. So, and some of that equality, of course, is around who gets the benefits of technology and who gets the impacts of climate. Yeah. So I think those three forces are going to sort of interweave and actually have a very strong influence on the space that we act and innovate within.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much here. It's kind of this. Kind of feel like I'm looking at all the different aggregate things I get fascinated by that roll up into this magic carpet that was sort of like flicking into the future, and all the crap's coming off it, and it's going to settle at some point. I mean, things like, I mean, because I've been working on projects in vertical farming and circular economy in all sorts of renewables and things. And then I remember my vote when it was like democratized voting, so participatory democracy, and this sort of transition. And I think of a Pete Seeger song where he talks about nobody expected the Berlin Wall to fall. Nobody expected this. Nobody expected that. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to collapse overnight. And the Cold War to basically just go, like these things we hold so like, and then and off we go. And that to me is hopeful, because at the start of this conversation, I was in the back of my mind, I was just gonna say, oh, how do you keep going? It seems, I remember doing Beyond 2020 zero, for Beyond Zero emissions stuff like 20 years ago now, getting all excited that this was the climate change decade and stuff. And I guess I look at trees outside and I think about their timeframes and how they grow and how they watch us meander around underneath them. And I guess it's just about avoiding critical tipping points, but I'm on a bit of a roll here.
No, but I think what I take from that is, again, come back to this idea of imagination. How do we cultivate mindsets which are going to be more open to thinking around ways that we could do things differently? And again, that's what, it's increasingly dawning on me that sort of we tend to see sort of innovation as kind of, has been the province of the business sector, highly allied to technology. But I think there's a different sort of understanding of innovation, which is far more, sort of democratized, which is like, collectively, how do we start to imagine more positive futures that we would like to inhabit ourselves and like to leave for future generations? And, because the mindset to engage in change, again, is the thing which is going to enable the possibility of change. Yeah. So how do we amplify those preconditions? I think there's great work that goes on in the education system now. I mean, the amount of programs, and they may be framed around entrepreneurship or innovation. I think we could definitely sort of lean more into the arts and culture as well, and not see that necessarily as a poorer cousin. But it seems to me that we are enabling a lot of young people to think about the futures they want to create for themselves. But there's also this interesting sort of movement now talking around, museums of the future and collective imagineering, and so like we do the past pretty well. Every even small town has some form of museum. Yeah. But are we creating the spaces where we can actually, to sort of, think in time towards the future as well? Mm-hmm. So it does come to me again, part of our ability to foster positive futures and change is going to be investing in the infrastructure. And whether that's, the intermediaries and platforms which enable the allocation of capital, or the platforms which enable people to organize and think about the things that they might want to, sort of change in their lives and the places around them. At one point, I know this didn't happen quickly, but after the Second World War, there was this sort of significant jump to public health systems and, kind of universal welfare and, education for all. There were these quite profound step changes. And if speed of transition and change is a societal priority for the 21st century, what's the infrastructure which actually kind of backs that up?
Yeah.
And again, that's what I mean. And certainly here, I think it is likely that government has to play a sort of a key role, but not alone. So I again, one of the conversations we like to have is thinking, what is the innovation infrastructure for this, for this century? How do we literally create the conditions for more people to change the world around them and to experiment, develop new ideas, projects, and ventures? Because that would seem a good investment to me.
Yeah, definitely. When I was listing the three things, the circular economy, the vertical farms as well, the thing in the back of my mind was as well, rites of passage for culture, like our actual culture, our people. How do we develop our people in this sense? And earlier you were talking to basically proof of work, an example, like creating examples to show larger systems change.
Yeah, demonstrations.
Demonstrations, yeah. And to me, the idea of going to a town that is, say, predominantly fossil fuel orientated and taking that sector and that postcode and just being like, right, let's transition these people into a renewable powerhouse. And then being like, great, see, that town got it done. Town next to them, hey, do you want this done? Those models of scalability just fascinating to me.
And I think you're on something here again, which is really important in so much as the value of a demonstration is again non-linear, because once you can, show that something else can be possible, that can become contagious, and that learning, can be, taken on board, horizontally very quickly. So, I think we had a chat with the head of design at the Swedish innovation agency, a guy called Dan Hill, and they adopt this kind of challenge-led innovation approach, very much a systems lens, and they called the value of demonstrations, rehearsals for the future, which I think is quite lovely. But there was something that you said there which I'm going to take issue with. Go into place again. A lot of this thing around the kind of innovation infrastructure has to be facilitating sort of this bottom-up empowerment.
Yeah.
Like rather than sort of the provision of services or the imposing of stuff, we have to unlock the latent human capital that we have. Yeah. Not least because if you want things to stick, you need there to be a sort of a broader sense of sort of ownership. So I do think that's a key part of this process. It's kind of creating the conditions for more people to participate rather than just come in, sort of up with the new systems or, rewiring, sort of our industries.
For you. I mean, your conversation is going to appear just after me speaking with Mark Ingram, who's the Chief Impact Officer for the Bright Light Group. And I think the thing I published yesterday was him saying that community-driven, community outcomes focused, market rate returns in that order of priority. So going and finding people who actually do want to do what they want to do and then saying, great, how do you guys want to run this? And then operationalizing it for them rather than coming in, as you say, imposing, or as I said, imposing on a place like you guys are now going to change for the future because it doesn't work. You need people, it just doesn't work. Are we talking about your national social enterprise strategy here? Back a bit? Is that what you were when you were talking about this blueprint, or is that something?
No, that's something different. So no, the national social enterprise strategy is a project which we have been supporting, as a partner. So certainly not ours, but it, social enterprise has been going on in Australia forever and a day.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very diverse sector with lots of different views, models, approaches, and it's largely been underserved as well. So while there has been sort of, organisation with sectors at a local level, and increasingly we've seen that happen at a state level, there's never been a national strategy for social enterprise.
Yeah.
So the social enterprise sector is sort of like, this would be really helpful, but how do we go through the process of standing it up? So we've been working with organizations and leaders across the sector to think around, like, how we can pull together, self-organize, and then create a direction which is actually going to make a really strong case to government and other partners which might want to see the development of that strategy and to see it get up and running. But also something which is going to serve the best interests of the diversity of social enterprise for the long term. Yeah, so that's been a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, fantastic. I was going to say, because to me that speaks to, just before we started this, I was showing you the work I've been doing for mental health, youth mental health intervention based on neuroscience. So basically to get in with the kids, heal them from trauma, and so they can go on to lead productive lives. And as a part of that, not only did my team map out the cost that the Australian government is currently spending on all these different areas of society, from like youth detention, and then long-term welfare and mental health support and disability, and like massive funding. And when we look at the like national rollout costs of these programs, they're tiny, and they disintermediate the chain of intergenerational welfare dependency. And getting to speak to people who do like foster care, like CEOs of foster care organizations and things, who contrast the amount of funding and support they get as a social enterprise compared to the expenditure of the government on the impacts of not treating the problems they're dealing with. There's this massive gap. And to stand back and take that systems lens to say, okay, we've got all these different funding funds, if you will, sort of impact funds, or basically people who wanted to do good, endowment funds, for example, who say that this is what they want to achieve, and they have a whole lot of invested money in an asset base that isn't potentially aligned with their values, and that transition of their asset base to their values. There just is so much scope to reimagine how the capital moves by getting everybody in the same room and going, look, we all share the same values. We all want the same things. How do we operationalize that? And then for the government to come in and say, yeah, we'll asset back that, because, social impact bonds, you pay for performance. Like, if you can reduce that, off we go. It just seems like such an honest problem to solve.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the things there is getting everyone in the room is, I'm not sure if even that's possible. I mean, and one of the key points I think that's coming out of a lot of the new kind of mission orientated or challenge led or systems based innovation processes, it's kind of saying, we're not going to try and make this tight and highly coordinated.
Yeah.
But what we do want to do is get broad alignment and direction towards the big things we want to solve.
Yeah.
And recognize where key intervention points might be. So like we have a Southern Cross, we have this constellation understanding of like, while we're working very different places, geographies, sectors, or kind of other contexts, if we can sort of have some degree of coherence towards the big things we want to change, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
And then we create this enabling environment, which just allows more bottom-up innovation to happen. So, and I mean, one of the big shifts that I think needs to happen, going back to sort of the role of the government and related to social enterprise, what you mentioned there about the huge amount of resources which sort of go into basically trying to change really difficult, intractable problems. But it's very much this kind of, a dominant view around service provision. If we just put more money into the delivery of things, that will solve it. But of course, there are so many different services, and they're working in incredibly complex environments, and they cross over and run past each other. I think there's a lot to be gained in a relatively modest investment into things like community and social enterprises, which are trying to sort of engage with the same problems, but in a more holistic way from a bottom-up point of view.
Yeah.
So thinking about like, how do we connect the environment, employment, education, social capital within a place? Sort of how do we bring connectivity, confidence, and self-esteem? And they naturally are geared to include people and develop solutions which kind of work for that specific context. So they can deliver the same things as some services can, maybe not all, but some services, but the way of facilitating their success is very different. It's not command and control, it's kind of creating this enabling environment. And I would like to think we would see a shifting in kind of government and policy over the next decade towards that. Governments do it very easily when it comes to business and technology. They're more prone to, fund innovation systems and incubators and, various different investment funds. And, potentially they should take a broader stake in those and realize public value from their risk taking, as Mariana Mazzucato would say. So, but we do that kind of enablement much more easily in the business and technology sector. But when it comes to the social sector, we still, sort of think that the kind of direct delivery of services is the appropriate way. So it'd be good to balance that out, because I think if you did create a more enabling environment for, these enterprise models which put, social purpose and social change at their heart, you could unlock this kind of flourishing of diverse and kind of inventive approaches across the country.
Yeah. I think I just want to caveat what I'm about to say with a preface, and that is I really like money. I think it's great. And I think having, money as a reward for providing value at scale is a great thing. That said, are we really just like stuck down here in the mire of privatization? Because to me, the government has just been privatizing for a long time. And so I don't see, do we need to pull that back? I don't even know how you would do that apart from appropriating assets. Is that a fundamental challenge here? I mean, because government is business and they're like, great, here, tender, be a service provider.
So I'm going to say two things. Firstly, I think we just have to be more sophisticated in how we harness different human motivations. And Matthew Taylor, who's the previous CEO of the Royal Society Academy of Arts in the UK, he speaks a lot about this in terms of three sort of motivations around individualism and entrepreneurship and personalized incentives. Then our need for belonging and solidarity and community and connection. And then our, sort of the motivation around sort of more sort of directive, control, sort of top-down authority and coordination. I think we've seen these as ideological positions which are in opposition to each other. So people, basically invested in one camp and then, and therefore, decrying those other approaches. I think we need to blend those motivations and recognize that we are individuals and we do things for personal gain, but we also want belonging and connection. And also sometimes top-down control and coordination is really useful. And so when we come to thinking around what is privatized, what's done by public, and what maybe should be kind of enabled through support of community, I think it's just like, well, what's the right approach for the thing which is in question?
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember sort of something which I just found so self-evident. I think it was in the UK, where you have a big national service firm delivering Meals on Wheels, which is basically install in a microwave and dropping off 30 lunches once a month, versus a social enterprise approach, which is recognizing, the food is the business here, but a lot of the value is around the connection and care, which goes alongside with the provision of that. So, having a social enterprise which is delivering Meals on Wheels and is financially sustainable, but doesn't have to generate profits other than ensure that it's delivering good quality service because it's held in community trust, seems to me a really appropriate model to contract out to, from government to contract out to, because, the approach fits the need.
Yeah.
If you're going to contract that service out to an organization which is driven by a profit motive, then of course they're going to go towards efficiency and may miss all that value around that human connection and care, which is possible if you take a sort of a more thoughtful approach. So that was a long answer, but I don't think it's one or the other. But I do think we need to be more sophisticated in thinking what organizational forms, what incentives, what levers do we use for what purpose, and then going back to where we started.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that those things join up and support each other rather than work in opposition to each other?
Yeah, I think it's a great answer, because the black and white idea of it's like capitalism versus the US interpretation of socialism is incorrect. It's not. It's not that. That said, do you feel we have enough people waving the flag for, I'd say, our holistic worldview of empowerment, in lobbying in Canberra, fighting against the various lobby groups who are pushing, like, I don't know why. I see figures about what we give to certain people for subsidies, and it kind of blows my mind. I'm like, well, but that's what you get if you have really effective people lobbying on your behalf over time, leveraging vested interests. That's what you get.
Look, I think this raises a really interesting point, and I'm glad you did. That there is a naivety, I think, in the social change, not in some aspects of the social change movement, or even actually the technology movement, that we can just develop good solutions. And if we develop better businesses and better solutions, then we can kind of make the change we want. But there is, sort of power is real. And there are a lot of people who are very successful in the way the world works now, whose interests it is to maintain the way things they, as they are. And I was really taken with the sort of expression predatory delay. And I think you can sort of see that happening around climate policy in Australia at the moment. There are actually a relatively small number of, parties who are overrepresented in how policy is being kind of shaped and deployed.
Yeah.
So I do think power is real. And if you're wealthy and you have power in the current system, that increases your ability to influence, change or not change, as it may be. So I do think, again, going back to this idea of systemic approaches, we kind of need business approaches, we need, finance approaches, we need community-driven approaches, we need social movement based approaches, but we also need, kind of activism and sort of policy change as well. So all those things, I think, have to be sort of part of a transition movement. And potentially we don't have enough people either lobbying or actually in power. And I mean, I must admit, one of the things I always come back to, that if someone was to say, what's your game-changing idea, if budget isn't an issue for the next 20 years, it might be to, kind of identify, curate and support a range of highly thoughtful, bold, gifted communicators to be our next political generation. Not holding a particular view, holding a diversity of views.
And next, what school generation?
Political generation.
Political generation. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If anybody's interested, I've got a little 4-pager called Let's Take Over, which is a manifesto of about 20 different aspects I think that should change Australian society, that I would like a whole bunch of people to read, agree to, go on to become independent candidates and take over the Australian Senate, because it's necessary.
It's necessary.
And it needs to be community driven. I've got Kathy Goes to Canberra on the shelf. Kathy McGowan going and being an independent, because it's what needs to happen. Because the fish rots from the head, per se. And it's not that we need to take over. That was me being a bit flippant, but it is a requirement to, well, no, we got to take over. We got to, the people run things. So if people want change, then they need to run the things. And it doesn't have to be combative, because there is a fundamental value system there. Though even when I was 20 years old, I would be out with hardcore activists who were doing their cycle of getting really involved for 3 years and then burning out, going away for 2 to 3 years, recouping and coming back to the fight, as it were. And I just say to them, I don't understand how you expect somebody who's 60 or 70 in a boardroom, who's looking at a golden parachute, who has grandkids, whose decisions relate to whether or not their grandkids are going to have their university and their housing paid, how you expect them to just gut that and say, you know what, burn it all down. They're just not going to do it. But such is the tension of living, the old Roman senators would sit there to be the warrior class, the diplomats, the artists. It's never been different. And I think an appreciation for that is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think there's that quote, I've forgotten who said it or the direct concept, but sort of politics advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah. There it is. There's a few people I'm waiting to kick off the coil to get involved. I've got here the we've already done the strategy. What are you excited about at the moment? I mean, I think there's a lot of things you're excited about, but if you were to
I am excited around Web3. I have to say, like, I've been avoiding it for a while, and blockchain and cryptocurrency, and thought it was quite frivolous, and I think many aspects of it actually are. But I think something's shifted in the last year or so, where enough things have kind of come together to create an infrastructure which gives the potential for really quite radical and profound change. So I literally don't feel I've come across something as potentially disruptive in pretty much the whole time I've been working sort of around change. And it's not a guarantee, but it's the glimmer, it's the possibility of something which feels really substantive. So I'm going down a learning wombat hole at the moment and feeling very exposed and very stupid, trying to get my head around this kind of, sort of the mechanics of the new world. But have had the opportunity to join a learning community which has been set up by some really sort of thoughtful people in Canada who recognize the potential of Web3. Sorry, the potential of Web3 for impact, but also recognize a load of people who are working in impact and innovation are not literate in that potential. So they've created this learning community to basically try and upskill a range of people to be, I guess, more cognizant of the potential that the third generation of the internet will bring, and actually then start to think about creating a DAO which starts to curate the emerging range of impact-led initiatives in that environment. So that's kind of really exciting me.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll send you a short video I made, which is like a 4-minute thing of the history of the internet from pre-modem to today with blockchain. Because I've observed it. Like I was an MC for a blockchain conference, so it got cancelled at the last minute. But I've done mining on my local computer, and I've been very anti-Bitcoin from an environmental perspective for a long time, and it being a speculative currency. And basically, if you want to be a day trader, go do it, but promising financial freedom to single mums if they invest. Probably my community bias from what I've seen, but I'm always a bit like, that said, I've done like a blockchain course with Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I'm looking regularly at different blockchain solutions because there's this fascinating ability now to just the decentralization of information is a fantastic thing. And there's no idea what technology things are going to be invented. But when I look at like the different like Civic Ledger and Water Ledger and things, Katrina and the team, it's really smart stuff. And I'm excited about something I'm working on. And it's, to me, when you went back to, I was going to ask a question previously about impact measurement standards and having a underpinning framework and how you suggest we measure the value transition, or at least the input transition and the evaluation of value creation towards a goal across the different players when we talk about, like capitalizing a systems change impact. And then to me, there's like, and then here's blockchain, but bringing those two things together right now in a quaint way is probably going to be really hard. But that is the decentralization of information. We could measure those inputs on blockchain. But my core question was, how do you suggest we measure across the sectors, across the sphere, if you will, of inputs in a way that's going to be useful for us to actually tell where we're capitalized? We are capitalizing the sector and we are creating positive impact.
Look, I mean, quite one of the things I often talk about in respect to impact measurement is kind of, I don't think it was until the early 20th century that we came up with a sort of generalized theory of accounts, for finance.
Yeah, I've got Rosemary Addis saying exactly that it was only like in the 40s or something that people were like, the ledger system.
So I think the framework and the thinking which would go alongside a more kind of universal kind of interpretation and valuation of impact is not within our view at the moment. So I think a lot of people look for the holy grail, standardized, sort of metrics and frameworks and stuff like that. I think it's really hard. I think, good practice and good impact literacy we talk about. So getting people to actually kind of understand the nuance and being able to design impact frameworks for the, activities or portfolios that they're engaged in. And I think, accompanying principles, things like transparency, are really important, like, sort of how we're sort of capturing sort of measurements and how we're interpreting them. And if it's the case, how then we're exchanging them for sort of more financialized, forms of value. So that's one thing. I think it's more a kind of capability set than a kind of specific kind of system or framework.
Yeah.
But I also think when we talk about systems change, we don't want to just talk about metrics from an accountability point of view. We want to think about signals from a learning point of view.
Yeah.
So how do we, think about our bodies, right? It's really useful to sense lots of things, pain, color, light, distances. I think when we're engaging in change, we should be thinking around how do we sort of build sort of sensing systems which enable us to understand what's going on and, the interlinkages between things, because that then enables us to adaptively manage.
Yeah.
So I think that's one element of the impact sort of measurement and management sort of discussion, which is really underplayed.
Yeah.
So
to me, that's the TCM, traditional Chinese medicine versus Western medicine approach to looking for a problem in the body and fixing it, rather than seeing everything as a consistent balancing act.
And also they're not mutually exclusive, right? So for sometimes, accountability is really important, particularly if that is going towards, choices around transactions or, what have you.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be necessarily dominant to that kind of balancing and understanding where we are in relation to other things and the change we're creating. So I'd like to see sort of a balancing up there. And then also being more creative around where we can get those signals from. There's a lovely story, I'm just finishing his book, called Tarzan Economics, a guy who was the chief economist at Spotify. And he mentions how the governor of the Bank of England went into Spotify's office to try and see if they could work with Spotify to get sort of broader insights around sentiment and economic sentiment. So rather than kind of outdated manufacturing statistics, if they had a sort of large data set, which kind of referenced people's interests and moods through podcasts and music, might that provide a signal, and you wouldn't want to necessarily rely on that, but building up layers of signals and information is a good way to navigate change, just as the way that we navigate our own lives, right? We're constantly receiving and interpreting data. And I think we should think about that as a kind of a story or metaphor around impact measurement rather than kind of just accounting.
Yeah. I was just having a giggle of thinking about how Amazon give you recommendations for all the things you'd like as a post breakup when your Facebook status changes, that kind of algorithm. The idea that the head of the Bank of England's going, all right, show me all the people that listen to depressed music when we've just released the latest budget. Like, what's the swing? Does everybody just go, oh?
Yeah, and that's why
it's crazy.
I mean, it is crazy, and what those kind of big, kind of colossal platforms have, signals on is quite mind blowing. I remember hearing a few years ago that basically you're most likely to split up in a relationship before a summer holiday or Christmas, and so
to me, it's coming out of winter, and it's like you come into spring, it's like, am I going to spend the next summer with this person? And then the end of autumn, it's like, well, I better lock down for the winter.
So that's quite frivolous, but I do think in anything that we do, we should be not just thinking about hard metrics and accountability, but be really open to the other signals which kind of give us sort of intelligence, which then enable us to do things better.
The conversational join me wants to flip over to how China's integrating an algorithm an algorithm policy to say to people, look, show us how you're actually going to use this. You need to register your algorithms with us. And I've seen the general sort of response of like, community, that you can't do that, freedom. And in another sense, I see how Instagram has destroyed the mental health of youth and a whole bunch of other things. And it's, I'm sure it's got positives. Yeah, there's a lot here. So what I would ask you is, we've got to really wrap this up. For people who want to do more, what would you say? Come to your course and learn? What would you?
Flippantly, if people want to do more, do more.
Yep.
And I think it's a case of, again, I'm going to butcher a quote here, and I forgot who said it, but it's not hope that gives course to action. It's action which gives course to hope. And I just think the positive feedback loops between caring about something, learning about something, trying something. The world is so big, it's overwhelming. The scale of everything is overwhelming, and so that kind of broad visibility, I think is really disempowering. But we can do small things in our everyday lives, and those small things. And I'm not getting to a sort of Pollyanna kind of do your recycling, we change the world. But I think from a mental health point of view, the possibility for people to be more open to engaging with others, I think that's probably part of it as well. Doing things in our own lives, but being open to taking more responsibility, either in an organizational context or a community context, but being more active and activist around the things that we care for and would like to see more of in the future. Ultimately, a lot of this does come down to choice, and it's not like just because we choose to have a better future that we'll get one, but that orientation to want to change things it's avoiding fatalism. And we don't know whether we're going to be successful in changing that, and bringing forth the futures we want, but we do know if we don't try, we won't. So for me, it's just like, care about something, live something, engage with others who, want to do similar things. And, that's probably quite an enjoyable life, as well as, feeding into, the potential for better futures as well. But sure, do come and study with us or do something or whatever. But, there's so much stuff out there now, right? It really is the sort of a choice, really. It's not about access to stuff.
And so by following your own advice, as you hit me as somebody who has done this and got involved, what have you got out of it personally?
I just got a great life. Yeah, it's I guess the thing around change, it's the creative process, and creativity is kind of a nice place to be. And and I think one of the other things is as well is I put boundaries on it as well. So enjoy the world and this one sort of life that we have as well. So I don't think I have to be careful here because I might be contradictory, but some people, all they can do is the change, sort of agenda. But I think for a lot of people, it's just, again, the small things at the right time, and don't sort of, invest in creating positive change at the expense of loved ones, personal interests, the beauty of the natural world, other experiences, right? Because if nothing else, that's likely to lead to burnout. And no doubt I've seen quite a lot of that in the social change field.
Just as for the audience out there, I'm a huge film fan. Surprise, surprise. And I think I've got a new favorite film. I saw it like 2 days ago. It's called 9 Days, and it's the best, like, visceral kind of what it means to exist and what it means to live, and the nuance of this joy of like the flowers behind you and the sunlight and things. And it's on YouTube. You can rent it. Go have a look.
I will.
So I want to let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure. There's a whole bunch we could talk about. I've still got pages and pages of all the amazing work you're doing in the world. So maybe we'll check back in again. So thank you so much for your time.
Anytime, Philip. Thanks for the conversation. The hour's flown past.
Organizational leaders you know that are hell-bent on changing the world for the better probably don't have the most effective strategy when it comes to digital marketing and video, and that's why I'm here. Get me in touch with them so we can get on this mission and we can create change at a much faster pace.